glad we could do this together. You realize that just by being here, you are tangible evidence. Is that okay with you? Tangible evidence of the Minnesota literary renaissance at its later stages. And my book outlines the early stage from 1958 to 1980 of this renaissance, a time when I'm trying to outline that poetry was reinvigorated in Minnesota, that public poetry readings became commonplace, that literary magazines, 20 of them, started being published, not just in the Twin Cities, but around the state, that small presses roared to life, literary communities were formed, and what else happened? Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, my wife keeps looking at me like, okay. That poetry and writing took on a role in the social, cultural, and political changes of the day, and this was kind of new. Also that contemporary poetry was introduced to the schools, imagine that, by contemporary poets of all people, not just by teachers, but by the poets themselves. And the loft was born and raised in this period of time. And this was all groundwork then for what I think of as the second stage, beginning in around 1980, when Milkweed Editions was born, when Coffee House Press and Grey Wolf Press transplanted themselves in the fertile ground that they found here in Minnesota. That the Minnesota Center for Book Arts was born, and then later in the 90s, Rain Taxi was established and has flourished like all these other organizations ever since. Culminating in the year 2000 with the establishment of Open Book, a center for the literary community, which I also see as ushering us into what I think of as the later Renaissance, the period that we're now in, and long may that later Renaissance run, of course. This may all sound a bit dry, but it was anything but dry. It was a very exciting time, and I only realized after this book was published that it constitutes, at least personally for me, a kind of love letter to Minnesota and to Minnesota's writers and the thriving literary community that has sustained me for decades. So maybe it's not as much a love letter as a thank you note, an extended thank you note. I just wanted to ensure that none of us here take this scene for granted. It didn't just pop, it just didn't arise by itself, but it's important to realize how it all happened. And by asking and answering a simple question, why did it happen here? Why in Minnesota, of all places, for God's sake? You know, not just in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but also in the whole state. Why not around Chicago or Milwaukee or Des Moines or St. Louis or Indianapolis or Detroit or Cleveland, for example? Why here? And I hope, and the answer is in this book, as I hope you will find out. Today I'm going to focus on the poetry at the outset, the poetry that got it all going. And so I'm going to read from the book bits and pieces. I hope they cohere. All right, so I'm going to start at the beginning. I know it's kind of boring, it's very prosaic, but I'm writing prose after all. I'm going to start at the beginning with chapter 1, which begins like this. In 1958, a young poet from western Minnesota started sowing seeds. He was a poet on the side of the future. Imagine this, or recall it if you were there, at a public poetry reading by Bly in his 1960s and 70s heyday, reciting his own poems and or his translations of another's. A witness could not help but notice the incessant movement of Bly's hands, whirling, swirling, not chaotically, but in a sort of counterpoint. They looked like a farmer's hands. Oops, I skipped yeah. Beyond distracting, one might see it as mere gesticulation, reflex action, habitual body language, or even a kind of beckoning. Better yet, call it poetry in motion. Still more apt is to see in those characteristic movements the practiced gestures of the sower as he traverses the ground, flinging seeds left and right, forward and backward, up and down, around and around. Bly was a sower sowing words. It sounds positively biblical. Neither haphazardly nor accidentally, the seeds are sown for the most part in good soil, cleared of rocks and thorns, loosened and plowed. Many of the seeds, each one a life-giving miracle with the requisite rain and sun, will take root and eventually blossom and bear fruit, manifesting in other poets and their poetry, leading them to repeat the process in turn. Thus, culture is created and sustained. By the late 1950s, Bly the sower had been gathering seeds and storing them in his own seed bank for a decade. First at Harvard, next while living the garret life as an autodidact in New York, reading voraciously, and then at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Last and most decisively, on a Fulbright in Oslo, he happened upon the poetry of Pablo Neruda, Juan Ramon Jimenez, Cesar Vallejo, Antonio Machado, Georg Trakl, Gottfried Benn, Gunnar Ekelöf, Rene Char, and others. Exotic plants, really, at the time, to North American poets. That bit of Norwegian serendipity was epoch-making. Its impact on American and Minnesotan poetry would be profound. Soon after his homecoming in 1957, he was ready to shoulder his seed bag and begin spreading the word. And now I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 4, which is a chapter entitled Homegrown Poetry, 2 Transformative Books. And it begins like this: to repeat, in 1958, a young poet from western Minnesota started sowing seeds. Does that sound familiar? I chose 1958 because that was when the first issue of his magazine, The 50s, was issued. And this was a magazine that rocked the poetry world in the United States from a farm in western Minnesota. And it was important enough that I wrote my previous book all about that magazine. But now I get to correct myself. I offer a provisional amendment to the opening statement. In 1962, with the publication of his first book, Silence in the Snowy Fields, a young poet again started sowing seeds. But to be clear, this was step 2, from then on concurrent with, not simply subsequent to, step 1. The sower was now circling closer to home, doing his proximate groundwork. The book's title could hardly be more evocative of Bly's rural home in wintry western Minnesota. Most of the poems therein bear the unmistakable signature of the place and are permanently resonant. That first book was a long time coming. Both the wide prairie of southwestern Minnesota and the woodland and lake country of the north, where his uncle had a cabin, fixed themselves at an early age in Bly's head, heart, and soul. He thus was not strictly partial to what Bill Holm called the horizontal grandeur of the prairie. Rather, he had in Holm's terms both a prairie eye and a woods eye, as his poetry makes clear. The prairie eye looks for distance, clarity, and light, the woods eye for closeness, complexity, and darkness. That's Holm talking. Bly's love for the entire state, its flora and fauna, its landscape, its weather, and its seasons was deep and abiding. He lived close to the earth and had a mystic's awe of nature. What one might presume would appear peripheral, dull, and unexciting to a sophisticated outsider is instead revealed as rich, complicated, and thrilling. That is, it is shown to connect with the inner life, too. Silence in the Snowy Fields made a big splash in the American poetry sphere. It received more than 40 reviews, Can you imagine? These were in print. This was not on Goodreads or on Amazon, 40 printed reviews. And it also allowed young Minnesota poets to discover what they didn't know they knew. He was pointing to subtle, important, and profound awareness of our geographical and climatological lives, also showing that beneath the mask of the ordinary, in darkness, silence, solitude, and in the attention to minute particulars, was to be found the other world with a concomitant sense of sacredness, the divine, and the eternal moment. Consider his poem in 3 parts. Oh, on an early morning, I think I shall live forever. I am wrapped in my joyful flesh, as the grass is wrapped in its clouds of green. Rising from a bed where I dreamt of long rides past castles and hot coals, the sun lies happily on my knees. I have suffered and survived the night, bathed in dark water like any blade of grass. The strong leaves of the box elder tree, plunging in the wind, call us to disappear into the wilds of the universe, where we shall sit at the foot of a plant and live forever like the dust. Even as Bly's world had been expanding in so many ways, especially after his discoveries in Norway, his poems began to narrow their focus when it came to landscape. He was finding his true center, using more of what was most immediate to his senses. At the same time, he was decisively throwing off the straitjacket of the academic poetry of that era with all its formal restrictions, meter, rhyme, the usual rhetoric and metaphors, and intellectualism. With subtle historical references, he uses straightforward, colloquial language. The poetry is subjective and personal, neither autobiographical nor confessional, intuitive, non-rational, and quiet. Bly has revealed his indebtedness to Whaley's translations of Chinese poems, Frank O'Connor's translations of Celtic poems, and his own translations of Machado. Elsewhere, he cites John Millington Synge, the Irish playwright and poet, whose work focused on the lives of Irish peasants, the rural working class. He also adds about Machado, he is the father of that book. In other words, these poems did not rise up spontaneously, fully formed out of the Minnesota ground. No, they grew from seeds he had gathered. He was hewing to and borrowing from some eclectic traditions, thereby bringing a new internationalism, a kind of cross-cultural collaboration, all informed now by Jungian psychological emphases. The poems, simple on their face, wore their learning lightly. These traditions were only implicit in the mix, almost as if by a kind of strange magic. For young poets, also from or in the countryside of Minnesota and the upper Midwest, the familiarity factor made the influence of these poems even greater. With his notable use of the first person singular pronoun I in this book, Bly surely helped all those young poets writing poems solitarily to feel affirmed as they assumed the same manner of representing their own outer and inner lives. 2 examples from Bly, the first being the first 2 stanzas of what we may call a woods or lake poem. These pines, these fall oaks, these rocks, this water dark and touched by wind. I am like you, you dark boat, drifting over water fed by cool springs. Beneath the waters, since I was a boy, I have dreamt of strange and dark treasures, not of gold or strange stones, but the true gift, beneath the pale lakes of Minnesota. Or this, the first stanza of Driving Toward the Lackaparra River, a prairie poem. I am driving, it is dusk, Minnesota. The stubble field catches the last growth of sun. The soybeans are breathing on all sides. Old men are sitting before their houses on car seats in the small towns. I am happy, the moon rising above the turkey sheds. The particulars were so obvious and meaningful to some. The universals were revelatory, reassuring, and freeing to all poets who had ears to hear. It was earth-shaking, really. The subject wasn't far away, in urban cultural centers on the coasts, but close by, just out the door or down the road. The extraordinary, the sometimes elusive spiritual dimension could be located in the apparently modest bits of one's own, not someone else's life. All it required was acute awareness and engagement. Poet Jim Moore speaks of the effect of this book on a lot of us who were young and trying to figure out what our heritage was and what it was worth writing about at a time of great national turmoil. Things were very unsettled, and to have this book come along with poems about the snow falling and so on was really quite wonderful. Suffice it to say, the book's effect was phenomenal. Patricia Hampel says that as an English major at the U, she studied mostly British, not American writers, and especially writers of the past. But she continues, when I read Silence, I experienced one of those galvanizing moments that change everything. I simply understood that everything that had been dismissed about the world around me, and which unwittingly I was being educated to dismiss, was in fact the material of a life's work, the reason to be a poet at all. And now I turn to the second book of these two transformative homegrown books. It was James Wright who received an issue of the 50s, a complimentary copy of the 50s, in the mail in 1958. Wright, whom I write about elsewhere in the book, at the time was spiraling down in a vortex of despair. He had just started as a faculty member at the U, and his first book had been greeted with widespread acclaim. But he saw that book as phony and felt like he was going to give up poetry. So he stated after getting this issue from Bly that stated just a tad hyperbolically that the magazine had saved his life. So his third book, The Branch Will Not Break, represents a sea change in his poetry, largely due to their fast friendship, their discussions, their co-translating of Tracal and Vallejo, and Bly's editing of Wright's poems, and it stands as the twin of Silence. That is, these two books together were the texts of the new deep image poetry. Wright had been looking for nourishing ground in which to put down roots and create. Since he had been going out to the farm, starting in September 1958, and staying overnight in the revamped chicken house, many of his poems were written or started there with clear reference to the landscape. And in his quest to find the spirit of the place, he took root. The Branch was another book full of dreams, moons, stones, bones, horses, and dust. And Wright had learned at last really to pay attention, to be patient. He had a rebirth and a new life concentrated on the new poetry. As one of the famous poems from this book, The Blessing, ends, suddenly I realized that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. He had not left his troubles behind, not at all, but he found some respite. Consider at the last this poem full of attention and mystery, Milkweed. While I stood here in the open, lost in myself, I must have looked a long time down the corn rows, beyond grass, the small house, white walls, animals lumbering toward the barn. I look down now. It is all changed. Whatever it was I lost, whatever I wept for, was a wild, gentle thing, the small dark eyes loving me in secret. It is here. At the touch of my hand, the air fills with delicate creatures from the other world. About the combined liberating effect that Silence and The Branch had on local aspiring poets, Hampel recalls, it may be hard now to capture the provincial self-consciousness and its attendant feeling of worthlessness of that era. There was this bulwark of legitimacy that made everything from New York, and better yet from London, what really counted. We received culture and literature. We didn't make it. Or we made it but were regional. Silence in the Snowy Fields and The Branch Will Not Break shifted that in a stroke. This new Minnesota poetry, sown first by Bly and then Wright, came into the fore over the next 2 decades, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul and all over the state. There was a sudden genuineness and self-consciousness in it, especially vis-a-vis the Minnesota landscape. An entire generation of poets in the region was directly inspired and influenced by these two. I'm going to end with another poem. This is coming down a notch, or I should say several notches from the sublime poetry we've just been hearing. But it's a poem that I think speaks a lot to the effect that these two books had, and to in fact, to this whole book. It's a parody. And this was written in 1977 by a friend of Bly's, and he had been a student of Wright's, I believe, too. His name was Don Olson. He was a letterpress printer, but also a poet. And you know, a parody can be simultaneously a critique and an homage. This poem is called the Cow Shit Poem. I'm going to end with this. It's got lots of exclamation points in it. Friends, I've gone back to the land. I can open the kitchen window and smell cow shit for breakfast. I travel only the dirt roads, and I love it. I love the land. I love the dust that sticks to my body. The good musty breath of the earth covers my skin. I walk the bean fields, I walk the potato fields, I walk all kinds of fields. Yesterday I walked 5 miles of abandoned railroad tracks. I saw abandoned barns, I saw abandoned farms, I saw abandoned cars, I saw abandoned people. I felt abandoned, and it was good. It was night. I feel abandoned best at night. So I stood in a cornfield, my arms raised to the sky. I was like a tall plant, and the green darkness a blanket over my body. I was alone among the stalks of corn. And the sun rose, and I looked around, and I was not alone. This was not a field of corn, but only long, long rows and rows of poets, hundreds and thousands of poets, standing in even cultivated lines, their arms raised to the sky. Thank you.
Hard one to follow. So when Mark asked me to read with him, and I'd been reading his book again after blurbing it, I thought, well, I need to relate this to Bly somehow. There needs to be some coherence to this evening. So I have a book called Poetry on the Side of Nature. It came out a couple of years ago, and what it is really a new view of the nature poem is essentially what this book is. And Robert Bly figures into it particularly in a couple of different ways, as he really does with everything that I write in a certain way. I'm one of those rows and rows of poets that Don Olson was talking about in that poem. So what I'm going to do is just concentrate on some approach to the nature poem that Robert helped to nurture through his translations. Mark doesn't mention Francis Ponge, the 20th century French poet, but he's very, very important to Robert's practice of the nature poem, I think, especially later on in his career. So one of the things I talk about in this book is something that I call the distance. And I'm going to read you a paragraph from the book that will help you explain that concept better than if I just stumbled around outside of my prose. So I'm talking about a poem by William Wordsworth called Nutting, which is one of the kind of the quintessential English romantic nature poems, in which a man goes out into a quote-unquote virgin nut grove and just ravages it, I mean shamefully, so that he's ashamed of it afterwards himself. for what he's done to this grove. So there is also a submerged layer of content in nutting, which we discover to be the sense of estrangement inherent in our dominating stance toward nature. This is not really what nutting is about. We could say instead that the deep or secret subject of nutting is the poet's anxiety over the distance between himself and the natural world. We can see the poem as a gesture toward closing, or at least addressing that distance. So I believe that the distance, as I've defined it here, is really kind of the secret or the submerged subject of most contemporary nature poetry. So I spent some time in this book. I'm tracing back through the Romantics, the American Transcendentalists, and then coming up into present-day nature poets, especially some of the better-known ones like Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm using that phrase, the distance, in this book. So I developed some strategies in the book for addressing the distance. And so this book is really essentially aimed at poets and people who want to practice the nature poem in particular, okay? So what I come up with is the idea that we close the distance partly through the repair of the nature poem. And in repairing the relationship, or repairing the distance, at one point in the book I pay attention to the French poet Ponge. Does anybody know this poet, P-O-N-G-E? Okay, so we've got a few here. A few people have taken my classes. So Ponge was born in the south of France in 1899, and he's well known for a book of prose poems particularly, which has been translated variously, but the one I like is Taking the Side of Things. Taking the Side of Things. Matter of fact, that's why I called my book Poetry on the Side of Nature. I'm echoing Ponge there. So Ponge worked with the resistance fighters in World War II, and he spent some time in the countryside in France and experiencing the shortages of wartime, and he would pay special attention to things that were hard to get, ordinary things that were hard to get, like soap. Matter of fact, he wrote a 100-page book-length prose poem about just plain old hand soap, okay? And it's good. It's really interesting. So Robert introduced Ponge to a lot of American readers through his translations, and one of his early translations was, or a couple of them actually, was in News of the Universe, Robert's 1980 anthology. And he translated some of them. Ponge wrote mainly about everyday subjects. Some of them are a crate, a candle, an orange, a pebble, and his tone isn't quite like anybody else's. He's philosophical, he's analytical, and yet he's kind of funny too, and kind of tender in a particularly French way. Ponge saw the object poem, which is a prose poem, as a child of the encounter of the poet and the subject of the poet. So that seems like a very French idea, the eros of the object poem. I'm going to read you one of these. This is Robert's translation. This will give you a sample of what Ponge's tone was like. It's called The Oyster. The oyster, about as large as a medium-sized stone, has a rougher look and a less consistent color, whitish in a dazzling way. It is a world bullheadedly sealed. You can open it, however. You must hold it then in the deep fold of a napkin, use a knife notched and not too honest, and try more than once. Fingers that are curious cut themselves, break their nails. It's not an elegant task. The knocks you give it leave whitish rings on the shell, halos of some kind. Once inside, you will find an entire world for drinking and for eating, beneath a firmament, to speak properly, of mother of pearl. The upper heavens slowly approach the lower heavens, making what is really only a pool of viscous and greenish pillow that rises and falls as you smell and look, decorated at the edges with a fringe of blackish lace. Occasionally, it is rare, a beautiful expression rises in their mother of pearl throats, and you find good reason then to adorn yourself. So that's Ponge's tone, and if you're not familiar with him, it probably sounds very, very odd in a way. But Ponge always entered into some kind of imaginative relationship with the subjects of his poems. So at the end, he's talking about putting on a pearl necklace. He doesn't stop just, with the look of it. He gets the feel of it in there too. Now, what happens when this particular form and this particular poet is brought over into English and then undergoing the mutations of being practiced here by Midwestern poets? Okay, which is part of the subject of Mark's book. This is a Robert Bly object poem, and he's following Ponge, but his tone is different, his attitude is different, and yet there are some similarities. It's called the cicada husk. You know what a cicada husk looks like, that a cicada has crawled out of? Yeah. I was at a week-long workshop with Robert in the late 70s in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and he was teaching this kind of poem all week. So we got to be with Robert all morning, and then the rest of the day was for writing our own poems, so it was fantastic. And the little cabin where we were meeting, the little lodge cabin on the lake where we were meeting, was festooned with these husks, and this is where this poem came from. I know the origin personally of this particular poem. The cicada husk. The cicada husk remains attached to the lower side of a log, the underpinning of a log cabin. It hangs by its feet cases. The head husk, from which the head has already pulled away, amounts to a curious box with bent turrets and double forehead, the consistency of rice paper. It is frail as those shrimp sheets that curl as they fall into boiling water. From the underside of its torso, the first pair of absent legs sets out. The two sections of each absent leg are about an inch long, dry as a wheat stalk, thinned out by delicate terror. And there are more. But the abdomen husk, how much one grieves the abdomen with all its vitals and eggs. The lower body shell is made of 7 paper lanterns or overlapping siding on an air house. The empty shell reminds one of those white Japanese paper lanterns that rich parents who want their children to leave hang in the trees for the garden party so that the children will admire the grandeur of the world. So that's what Robert could do. He could start out with just a little lowly, frail cicada husk and end up with the grandeur of the world. Not everybody can do that. You want to know what Ponge thought what he was doing with these? This is a great statement by him. So he's writing this in 1950 after the war, and he was ostensibly writing about the drawings of the painter Braque, but he's really describing himself and what he's doing in these poems. So here it is. Never it would seem from the time the world is a world, never has the world in the mind of man, and precisely, I suppose, from the time he began seeing the world as no more than the field of his action, the time and place of his power. Never has the world functioned, it's in italics, never has the world functioned so little or so badly in the mind of man. It no longer functions at all, except for a few artists. And if it does function, it is only because of them. Here then is what some few men feel, and from that moment of their life is traced out for them. There is only one thing for them to do, one function to fulfill. They have to open up a workshop and take the world in for repairs, the world in pieces as it comes to them. Got that? That's what these poems are. These poems are pieces of the world brought into the workshop to repair, because the whole rest of the world is so damn broken. Here then is what some few men feel, and from that moment their life is traced out for them. There is only one thing for them to do, one function to fulfill. They have to open up a workshop and take the world in for repairs, the world in pieces as it comes to them. From then on, any other plan is wiped out. It is no more a question of transforming the world than explaining it, but merely putting it back into running order, piece by piece, in their workshop. That was translated by Beth Archer Brombert, who had a wonderful earlier collection of poems that Robert was drawing on called The Voice of Things. Now, I don't feel like I have time to go much farther with this, but what I want to do is I want to read one of my own poems that follows the Poems Bly track, because I took 2 of these workshops from Robert, and we just wrote like crazy, and I kind of learned the method, and I teach it a little bit now sometimes. So this is my own take on the object prose poem, and I think I'll end with this, and then we can answer some questions or get into some conversation. That seems okay. So this is called Breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs. It's a appropriately humble, Ponge-esque subject, right? On the floor yet. On the floor. Okay? So it's really humble. What do we really know of them? Those fragments of the loaf that, despite their best efforts to shine in winter sunlight, in the end seem only a display of squalor, to be pummeled by the fists of a broom into the sordid gutter of a dustpan. A breadcrumb can never regain the paradise of the loaf. Yet neither can the loaf's purpose be accomplished without its being broken, separated from itself by that cutting or tearing with knife, hands, and teeth that hastens bread into useful states of division. To us, who have only from a distance of scale glimpsed the interior magma of spun gluten, a breadcrumb is a bridge to nowhere or a cavern in air. But what is a breadcrumb to itself or to God? On a winter afternoon, a breadcrumb throws a shadow many times its own size in the slant rays on a kitchen floor. Okay, thank you. So we're probably supposed to each grab a microphone.
Really?
I guess
Oh,
so.
there's one
There's
here.
one on the chair.
Thomas, you gotta put that on your tombstone. What is a breadcrumb to God?
Could be worse. Okay. So this is supposed to be a conversation, and I guess we've set it up so that it's a conversation between our books, but now, what about us? Wow, this is really live. So who has a question? Mr. Padilla?
Yeah, I got a question for Mark, which is, I think I've been haranguing you about this for a while now.
Uh-oh.
So, at the end of this latest book, we're at what moment in time?
We're in the present moment. Have you really gotten to the end yet, Dougie?
Well, I've gotten within a chapter or so, but it doesn't seem like we're in the present because, no, excuse me,
not
that's
there.
not my question. The question is, where are we at with Bly? Because we don't have, you haven't gone into, are you gonna go into all the political stuff you did and then the men's movement? Are you gonna do those books?
No, this book, as it says states on the cover, it says 1958 to 1980. So
Right.
it's cut off right there.
Yeah, so then, okay, when do you start the next one?
Oh, I see.
Because I'm waiting to read it.
Yeah, you have been pushing me on that, and believe me, I feel the weight of it. It's gonna happen soon after I talk to you and Tim and Thomas about all that stuff.
But it is in the chute.
It's in the chute, so to speak, yes.
And it'll be, cause I was around for a lot of stuff, but I was in the periphery of a lot of it.
Uh-huh.
And then when this, when the men's stuff happens, I got more in the middle, but I wanna hear about the places that are kind of, I mean, you're filling me in on a lot of stuff, and there's still a lot of blank spots.
Yeah, well, it's good to know your history though, Dougie, before you move on to the later stuff, yeah. That's my answer.
So it's coming,
It's coming,
alright.
eventually. I should live that long, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, there's one back
Yeah.
here.
Appreciate you talking about his physical presentation, his performance. It brought back some,
Mm.
when I saw him, about the same time as you're talking about 1970, 1971.
Uh-huh. When he didn't have a mask in his one hand and an instrument in the other.
No, he had instruments.
Oh, he did that
Yeah,
too,
but
yeah.
he had the,
Yeah,
the serape,
Yeah.
and his movement with his arms.
yeah.
It really registered with that.
Well, I'm glad cause that became sort of an important device for this book. It was my thinking that it was like sowing seeds. Suddenly it all fell together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you gonna go into any of his later period? I mean, Man's Blackbird Turn, Iron John, I mean, did the whole movement sort of follow him that far?
One day I will go back and talk. Yeah, in my thinking for this book, I don't get much further than Sleepers Joining Hands, his third major book. And after that, I sort of, I'm kind of a little more at sea, so it'll happen. Again, I should live that long, yeah.
You will.
Okay, thank you, darling.
I have a question. I'm wondering how Bly is regarded now in that I read poetry magazines and I just don't see many nature poems or certainly pastoral poems. Or maybe, okay, question mark.
Well, that's what my book is supposed to help with. If enough people buy it and read it, then people can become more aware of the important role that he had in American poetry at a certain time. And I do love this. It was one critic I read writing about Bly, and he was not in Bly's camp at all, but he said really deep image poetry, which Bly and Wright were really most responsible for, has been the most successful school of poetry in American history. That this became the kind of poetry that was taught in poetry workshops as the MFA programs took off and so on in the 70s and 80s. It became the most common type anyway, but I don't know what you think about that, Thomas.
Oh, that's interesting. I think also Robert right now is undergoing that kind of instant forgetting
Yeah.
that someone experiences in this culture when they die. Many of the great poets of his generation are hardly ever mentioned except by those of us who have already read them. I mean, it's happened to William Stafford, it's happened to Galway Kinnell. At least the Unitarian churches are keeping Mary Oliver alive.
It's the great eraser at work.
Yeah, and it's, and I think the other thing is that Bly is not necessarily that easy to understand if you try to look at him whole, and that's part of the Herculean task that Mark has undertaken right now, is to try to somehow give us some vision of Robert whole, and I think that takes a long time, and I think that there are certain turns that he takes, especially toward the end of his career when he goes into the Mideastern ghazal form, that some fairly intelligent, sophisticated poets in this country still don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
So I can't remember who said this. Do not understand me too quickly. Well,
Yeah.
that's the story with Robert.
Yeah.
He's not being understood too quickly, but hopefully remembered.
But how much do you think of, I mean, in the arts, everything, there's just fashion, and fashion just keeps,
Yeah.
you know, how much is this fashion that's gone to the next shiny object?
Especially in consumer capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah, back here.
Well, just, hi, my name's Joshua Preston. Just responding to the conversation here, I mean, I think part of this is also generational, right? I mean, so I'm 34 years old. I think I was born either a few days before or a few days after Iron John was published, right? So when it comes to the idea of, whatever the mythopoetic men's movement is meant to inspire within modern American masculinity, I mean, that's something that's still very new, right? I mean, like the idea of gender studies departments are still, like, that's an innovation from the boomer generation from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but there's this generational turn of actually integrating into young people's lives as they go out into the world. I offer that just as a response to what's been said, but one of the more telling things for me, and I grew up in Montevideo, outside my bedroom window I could look down and see the train station in Monte that Jim Wright would come from Minneapolis to, and then Bly would sit in the parking lot with Carol Bly, pick him up, go off to the chicken coop. So someone who's been socialized, who's grown up in this literary space, who's a beneficiary of the many seeds sown by Bly. One of the most telling things was at Bly's funeral, when I forget the gentleman's name, where he made it very clear to remind all of Bly's boys, all of Bly's children, who to me are elders, reminding them, saying, Robert's an ancestor now. Robert's an ancestor. What happens now? And so my question, because you have to remember for there to be a question during a Q&A. As people who knew the man, and not merely the myth or the person like me, I might write about academically as though write about Robert Bly the subject versus Robert the man. What would he have to offer to the present moment? What advice, what wisdom comes from, I mean, that part of y'all's spiritual literary life? What can y'all offer us here now, knowing Trump's about to be reinaugurated in a few days?
That question is for you, Thomas.
Sibling society.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I wish to God that Robert was alive to be writing an op-ed for the Star Tribune.
Yeah.
One thing. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's an answer to that. I think it all depends on where and how the seed fell in all of us individually. I mean, we can point to things that he did, things that he said. His interest in Jungian psychology, which helps see deeper into the historical currents of the time. I mean, he was a psychohistorian as well, and he was able to look below the surface of somebody like Trump and see, what was really going on with his psyche, which is a real horror show. So I don't know. That's not really an answer, but it's, you know, it's a grope. It's a
We're all,
grope.
we're all groping in darkness together,
I mean,
right?
it's a good,
Yeah.
really good question, really good question.
I like you referring to him as a psychohistorian, which is a term I've used recently about him too. I have an article coming out this spring, which I call Haunted in a Landscape of Ghosts, Robert Bly and Little Crow. Because I discovered that in college, he won a prize as a senior for a 171-line poem called The Indian Trial, which is all about the aftermath of the Dakota War in 1862. And as I look through this, I start thinking he actually prefigured this idea of this current idea of settler colonialism, that this is settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, and that's all in his psychohistorical understanding too. So he was prescient on many scores.
You know, I worked for Robert for about 30 years as his assistant, and I know that one thing that he was very interested in, I don't know if it still exists, but there used to be a journal of psychohistory, and he maintained a correspondence with the editor of it. He was fascinated by that, and I think it's part of that is a key to, you know, how he was able to, you know, get underneath the skin of current events and historical events. And psychohistory basically is to apply depth psychology
Yeah.
to historical events and not just, you know, take them at face value.
Good to know. I wish I had talked to you earlier.
Still
It's
talking.
not too late.
It's not too late.
Just a quick observation, I'm not a poet or a writer, I'm an observer and sometimes an enabler. But, you know, lots of times, you know, there's an earthquake that happens and it causes a tidal wave, and there are ripples that flow for a long time from that tidal wave. And in a certain sense, I got to see Robert
Mhm.
lots of times in private and public events, and there are many of you who studied with him, who write like him, who are carrying forward. You're the next big ripple. Behind you, there are other ripples that I see coming. There are people who don't even know what caused that initial ripple, that initial tidal wave, because he's beyond them. But they're doing things that are changing how poetry is thought of. They're doing things that are different now in the same way that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, Robert did different things.
Mhm.
And so I think my observation anecdotally is we don't have to worry about Robert's legacy, because you and 30-somethings are already enabling it and following it, and those ripples, they're maybe a little bit diminished, but they're not nearly as diminished as you might imagine.
I appreciate your optimism,
I'm
Ed.
totally optimistic.
And, you know, my book ends with a postscript in which I quote this entire poem by Denez Smith,
Yeah.
which I find has this kind of connection with what Bly was doing. And I was astounded when I found that poem, and it seemed so connected somehow. So it's good, it's part of those ripples.
Yeah, and sometimes they take a left-hand turn, those ripples.
Yeah.
You don't even know why, but
Yeah.
that's what happens. But they're still out there.
Yeah, well, that's culture too, and nobody can control culture, you know, sorry. You know, you might think you've got, you know, some kind of driver's wheel, but no, culture goes where it goes, and everybody's feeding into it, and as long as the planet's alive, the unpredictable and the unpredicted is going to happen. But the good tends to be preserved. I think there's a tendency for that. Yeah, back
Do
then.
they teach Bly poetry at the universities?
Who knows? Anybody know?
Who knows? Yeah.
I'm not in university.
I've been looking for, whenever I go to any bookstore in Minnesota, I look for Roberts in the poetry section, and I usually don't find anything. He's not sold much anymore.
But for being taught in the universities, he'd have to be in anthologies, right? Some of the big anthologies, and whether that's true or not, I don't know.
And that's a tricky problem, because a best-selling book of poetry sells 3,500 copies.
Right,
In a whole book.
Yeah.
And if you sell 40,000 copies, you're a friggin' rock star.
Yeah,
And so that's just the nature of books of poetry.
yeah.
But that doesn't mean there aren't people still looking for him and mimicking him without maybe even knowing it.
Mhm.
But that, we should be able to sell more than 3,500 or 5,000 copies of one book of poetry. You would think.
We're in the wrong country for that.
Yeah.
Oh, can I,
Yeah.
so one time you were there, I'm sure he was there, at one of the retreats, when he had come back from Russia.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that, so in the Soviet Union, they were apologizing, tell me if I'm wrong here, they were apologizing because like only 25,000 showed up at the
Yeah.
stadium to hear him read. And
Yeah.
they had, it was an international poetry thing, and they'd chosen 2 Americans, Robert Bly and Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And they were apologizing because only 25,000 people showed up.
Yeah, that was 1985.
Yeah. And Seamus Haney was there.
Seamus Haney too, that's right. Well, you know, I mean, Neruda used to fill up stadiums in Chile too, before Allende was overthrown, so, yeah.
I'm sorry to reference my own book again, but in was it 1956 or 57, Williams Arena was filled 14,000 people to hear T.S. Eliot speak about criticism.
Yeah.
And the way I see it, that was really the pull of Alan Tate in those days at the university. That seems impossible.
Well, you know, I mean, Ginsberg got a couple thousand people at St. Thomas last time he read in the city. That's the biggest poetry audience I've ever seen, Allen Ginsberg.
Well, this is pretty big, though.
I got a friend who says, you know, poetry is such a minority art that for any poetry audience, what you really need to do to get the equivalent size of other audiences, you multiply it, each person attending, by 7. So, you know, I've said, yeah.
I heard it.
That's-
So people,
That said, you know, I'm just always amazed at how many poetry readings there are each week in the Twin Cities. So I don't, it's rich, and I don't know, who was it saying that he didn't think it happens in Chicago like that. I mean, this is happening right now, every single week, many poetry readings all over the Twin Cities, so.
Yeah, not one big audience, but many small audiences.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another poetry over at Unitarian right now,
Yeah.
tonight, so.
There was one 2 days ago.
Yeah.
that-
Who's there? Maybe we should be there.
Manchester.
I think that's right, Mark. I think poetry readings are a big deal
Yeah.
compared to selling poetry books. If we could get everybody who goes to a poetry reading to buy a book, we have more than
Yeah, you hear that, everybody?
Now let's move to the table.
Rachel, is it time for us to?
Yeah, I think that's a great note, Ted.
Do we have one, is there one more burning question here? We can answer questions up there too. Oh, okay.
Well, just to come from the female side, I don't think I was really acquainted with Bly until I joined Northfield Women Poets about almost 40 years ago. And one of their members, and I'm losing her names, had a called Black Hat Press. And I'm sorry, her name is gone. But I began hearing, I mean, it was a wash, a way, or a ripple from Robert Bly, because some of the writers knew him. And it was a ripple that you know, kept us going throughout all those years, meeting once a week. I drove from Rochester to Northfield because I needed to have real writers, not ones I found in cocktails. But, they made me pick holes in my fingers. So I got to, in the Northfield Women Poets group, and as you were talking, as you were talking about Bly and I thought, oh, I was part of that, but I didn't know it.
Exactly.
I didn't know it, and it was just, going there was like, I could breathe again. And, I kept writing, and, it's, so thanks for this.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to, say something about that too. It's not that Robert was the best, poet, in the United States. I mean, there were several great poets of his magnitude, but one thing special that he had, as well as his other gifts, was Robert had a gift for community, for community making. He created the Great Mother Conference community. He created a certain men's community for a while, and a rural western Wisconsin, rural western Minnesota community out there, near where he was living in Madison. So, I think that it's important to acknowledge that gift for community was one of the big factors that made all of this that Mark has been chronicling happen.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, I
and,
hope that
and
comes
his,
through in the book too, but,
and his feeding and responsiveness to poets, young poets, but being engaged, that kind of generosity. Instead of I'm just writing my own poems, I care about all of this poetry.
Is that a good place to end?
sounds good to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.